Hi, everyone. So I am going to change it up a little bit and do about 3 minutes where I'm going to just go over a brief overview of what I've done and what I think the Sustainable Development Goals have meant in my work. And then I'm kind of going to open the floor for discussion and questions and conversation. And feel free to ask whatever you want. I will take questions ranging from what's the best flavor of ice cream to what's the best goal to work on. I promise to answer them all as honestly as I can in my own opinion. So I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in Canada, and I lived there until I was 15 when I finished high school and I moved to Libya, which is a neighboring country of Italy, so not too far from here. Our food is as delicious, if not more so. You should come check it out. And I started medical school there. When I was 21, I founded an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women, which focused on women's political participation and more directly women's inclusion in security and peace processes, because I noticed that oftentimes in countries of conflict and post-conflict, if women are not included at the time of nation building and really peace building, they're not going to be included down the line. It's a much more difficult, and you can kind of envision it like building an infrastructure system, right? It's easier to build something new than it is to tear something old down and put something else there. So the idea was to ensure that women are included from the very beginning. Our campaigns, like the Noor campaign, are now replicated globally and have been cited by the UN as campaigns which work and which create significant social change and legal change. And everybody on our team, unsurprisingly, was under the age of, I'd say, 25, 30. There is an echo. It's annoying. Like, I think my voice is great, but I definitely don't want to hear it twice. So everybody, no, what is under the age of 25 when we started, everybody is still under the age of 30, sorry. And in 2015, I ended my tenure as president. I'm still on the board, but I started another organization and a women's mentorship program. And the mentorship program is predominantly for minority women who would like access into the public policy space on a global level. And that's because a lot of young minority women are doing some pretty kick-ass stuff locally, and they don't have the same I say pathway, or the same very visible pathway that a lot of young men do. And so it became, and it continues to be, probably the cause that is most dear to my heart. And from the success of that and from the work we've done there, we started the Omnis Institute, which focuses on leadership, mentorship, and capacity building, as well as learning from local leaders on 4 key areas, which are migration, trafficking, security, and international engagement. And I'm also the executive director of Phase -1, which is focused specifically on security and inclusive and comprehensive security solutions, and challenging ideas like the securitization of health or migration. So if you guys can think of almost any crisis in the past 20 years, usually it'll be the war on poverty, or the war on drugs, or the war on Ebola, or the war on refugees, right? And it's this securitized rhetoric which really challenges our ability to actually create peace rather than kind of just fend off temporary conflict. So I also have the pleasure, along with Jeff, of being one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goal global advocates. And I often do not use the term Sustainable Development Goals because they are a mouthful. And everybody I work with just understands global goals a lot better. But it is, for me, they have been for me, I think. So the SDGs are interesting. I have started a local organization in a conflict country. I know it's not a reality to go to people who are trying to make sure they get their food and water and tell them, hey, these Sustainable Development Goals are super legit, you should start working on them. By the same token, they've been a great source of community for me, in the sense that they've given me kind of a piece of paper that I can get into certain rooms with and say, listen, you've made promises, you have to adhere to them. And it's something that I was able to do when I was younger with Resolution 1325, which for those of you who don't know is Women, Peace, and Security. It was barely implemented and continues not to be implemented well enough on the ground, but having that documentation, having that public and that political support meant that I could use it to access rooms and meetings and spaces of influence. And so I think the SDGs, in my experience, have been used very similarly by a lot of the organizations that I've seen and worked with. And I think my question to all of you, and what I'll start the discussion off with, is yesterday when I spoke to you guys privately or hearing in the public panels, there wasn't a lot of commentary on how, if you've been able to leverage the SDGs in your work, and if it's been successful. And if not, why? Like, what can we do to make it more applicable locally? Or do you think it doesn't necessarily work in your particular context? And I'll turn it over to you guys, and you guys can discuss.
Thank you, Alaa. So please raise your hand if you could reflect on, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. Just to answer your question, so I spent some time in Niger, and I usually use Niger as a country because being an African, I've never ever seen the level of poverty that I saw in Niger. Niger has a population of 17 million people. 50% of that population is under 25. 89% of the girls would marry off before their 15th birthday, and 17% of the girls only 17% of the girls are literate. And when I was going to Niger, it was when Boko Haram had attacked neighboring Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. It was a very scary moment. And the time I spent in Niger, I saw these young girls, all, going about their daily activities. Get up in the morning, carry water, or go to the farms, while the boys would, take the animals to the mountains. And I was asking myself, when we talk about the SDGs, are we just talking about, something on paper? How do we leverage the SDGs to help these people who will be left behind? It's for sure. We cannot yet say that.
So what's the answer you came up with?
I couldn't. And I couldn't because the institutions in these parts of the world are not legit. The institutions, the government is doing nothing. And we cannot, for decades, be expecting support coming from outside of Africa. It has to be within these countries. And if these countries cannot support...
So I'm asking you, what are your ideas? I get it. I'm from Africa. I got you. What are your ideas? What's the plan? The country has signed on to the SDGs, right?
Yes.
There is a regional body, multiple regional bodies, which engage in Africa. So tell me, as a young leader, what's your plan?
To start, I would say education. That's the plan. Because, you want to say something?
That's an idea, but what's the plan? Education, give me a strategy. If I am a young woman in your country and I'm saying, listen, I want education, I want access, and the government has signed on to a plan, to an agenda, they have made international promises. What, as a young leader that has access, that has education, that has capability, that can be in places like this, what's your plan?
Good question.
I know, I'm brilliant.
Yeah, so I would say it has to start with awareness. And by awareness, I would say that, we as young people, we need to speak up. And the plan is not going to the government and telling them we need the services. but the plan is making sure that we are part of the decision-making process of those institutions that we see each day. It's somehow a little bit difficult because freedom of speech is a big problem in this part of the world. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a very, very complicated question. So, I don't know.
That's fair. I'm glad you're thinking about it, though. That's what matters.
Please.
En español, ¿ok? Algunas veces yo tengo la impresión que nosotros no tenemos formación suficiente sobre los ODS para multiplicar esto en nuestros países. La mi pregunta es muy simple. ¿Qué la ONU puede hacer para formarnos un poco más como líderes? Formación. No digo que nosotros hagamos un evento como este para hablarnos, pero para escucharnos de ustedes, porque yo tengo realmente la impresión que nosotros no sabemos de los ODS. Yo he aprendido ahora mismo de profesor Jeffrey otro ODS que yo no sabía, es muy importante para mi país, sobre la corrupción. Entonces, la mi pregunta, ¿qué la ONU puede hacer para formarnos como líderes? Nosotros tenemos que tener formación. No es suficiente que nosotros vengamos aquí y hablamos para ustedes. Tenemos que escuchar de ustedes. Entonces, ¿qué puedes hacer para formarnos más, para que podamos multiplicar estas informaciones en nuestros países?
I feel I also want to kind of reinforce into that. I come here and I feel that it is only because coming here and hearing from you and being to several MUNs, I can more or less understand the language in which the UN talks and the language in which you express, but it is a whole vocabulary, and it is a whole perspective and vision about the world. And sometimes I feel a little frustrated when having to engage in certain communities where people don't even know, sometimes we face victims of human trafficking that haven't even heard the word victims or trafficking. And I have to explain those as well to them, to the police officers, so that they can pick up their complaint. And so coming here, I understand now because of this session that we are part of the SDSN Youth Network. But sometimes I do not know how to use that tool. I don't even know how much I'm allowed to say what or how to explain it. And how much can we actually bring that as being ambassadors for the network? I just don't know how to use the tool, but I feel that's conversations I've had with other people. It's a little bit about that, about actually just not knowing how to use that amazing tool that we've been talking about.
¿Puedo hacer una sugestión? Una rápida sugestión. Yo no sé si es posible, pero en otra ocasión, juntarnos para formarnos, no solamente para que hablemos, más que nos formen para que nosotros podamos multiplicar esto. Formación. Es importante que nosotros hablemos. Yo creo en esto, claro. Nosotros tenemos que hablar, nosotros tenemos que presentar nuestros proyectos. Yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo con esto. Pero en otra ocasión, yo pienso que sería importante que un simposio pudiese formarnos. Es esto.
Me? All right. Hello? Okay, we're good. Hey, guys. Well, in regards to education, I've been hearing about it since yesterday, and I wasn't going to speak until hopefully next year if I was invited again, but it seems like this seems to be the appropriate place. Basically, in Dubai, we're trying to build up an initiative where we're going to make a Dubai pilot project in regards to education for community service learning, integrated and paired with SDG learning. So you've got the theory of SDG learning, where people will learn in each individual classroom from middle school all the way to undergrad and college. And obviously based on their age and skill level, they'll be able to do more with each SDG. And how they give back is through community service learning, which has actually been very well done in the States since, I believe, the early 2000s. If we can take both theory and action through the integration of community service learning, we can actually put sustainability within this initiative on a global scale. The reason I say Dubai is a pilot project is because it's one of the few cities in the world that has multiple curriculums, learning systems. American, British, French, Arabic, you name it, they're all over there in Dubai. And alhamdulillah, God bless, with our contacts in Dubai, we would be able to push this through, hopefully.
Okay, let's take one more and then.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask about the importance of mentorship and the actual way in which we can implement it. I ask this because, as my colleagues were saying, it is not really common to find on the ground important knowledge about the SDGs, and also it is really hard for people we probably work with, and even for us, to find figures that can be role models. I talk about this, again, as a woman in science, and I'm pretty sure you can see it as a physician. It is really, really hard to see women in our fields that have managed to get to positions in which they can be an important figure and an agent of change. And my question is, what do you think, in your experience, is the best way to be a mentor? Because, as Sam was mentioning earlier, it is really important for important personalities to invest in the youth. But I don't think right now I'm, for example, in the peak of my career, but I do have a degree in STEAM, and that's a complete different story to the majority of the girls from my home country in Mexico. So I think, I'm pretty sure I was the first Latin American on graduating from the physics department of my university. And that was really hard because I never found a person that I could see and say, oh yeah, she did it, it is possible, I can do it. So,
You be your own role model. You sound like a role model to me.
Yeah, exactly. So if now I want to go to other girls and say, you can do this, let's do it together, what's the best way to do it? It's just talk
Just show up.
Exactly, just show up or do something more.
Well, I mean, you have to do something once you get there. But what I'm saying is you have the credibility to show up and say, look, I've managed to do this. You have more credibility than anybody else to a young woman who's interested in STEM in your community, right? Like, you literally are the embodiment of what she would like to achieve. So I think the challenge, at least for me, I never had a mentor. I did, in the sense of I had women I look up to who I think have done incredible, incredible, incredible work. But in terms of them being in my field, not necessarily. In terms of them being able to open up doors for me, not necessarily. The vast majority of people I work with, given that I work in security and global development, are about 50 to 60-year-old white men. So there's not very many people who look or sound or think like me in the room, which, you know, is a double-edged sword. I've learned a lot because of it, but I've also wished oftentimes to have other women in the room. And I learned pretty early on, the only way you get other women in the room is if you're already in that space, you open that door. And that means you going maybe to universities and to high schools where you know young girls might be interested in this but might think it's tough, and saying, listen, this is my email, reach out if you want to talk to me, or here's my phone number, send me a text message. And it can start off very, very informally. That's how my mentorship program started off. It was very much, if you have a question, feel free to ask, don't feel ashamed to, right? And I'm not saying, listen, I don't think anybody is a mentor in the sense that they have all the answers. I don't think I have all the answers, and I'm sure a lot of the people who've worked with me and my mentees who Jeff's met when they've come to UNGA for the past couple of years will tell you that I've messed up a time or two. But I think that's part of mentorship. I think letting people see you fail and recognize that it's hard work and that you're showing up despite the fact that you might not know the terminology and you might not have, you know, all the answers. I think that's part of it, but show up. Tell them, listen, I've done this, I'm here, and it's not, because, you know, for a lot of young women, merely the fact that you exist and you've been able to do it and you continue to do it, despite societal pressures, is more than enough. And you'll find a lot of people come into their own when they recognize that there are other women in that space who have kind of dominated or at least done what they have in it, right? To cover the other questions real quick, what can the UN do to train us to be leaders? I have a very controversial opinion on leadership, and that's that I don't think everybody is innately a leader. I don't. I think everybody can be a leader, but I think that takes a little bit of self-initiative. I don't think the UN can go and teach everybody who wants to change the world. That's not what the UN has capacity to do. The UN wouldn't even know I exist if I didn't show up. When I was 21, the UN was staying in a compound in Tripoli in Libya. I don't come from Tripoli. I live in a city about 45 minutes away called Zawiya, and they hadn't come. So I went to the hotel, and I found a group of men sitting in suits eating lunch, and I introduced myself, assuming they were important because they were men sitting down eating lunch, and they turned out to be the UN. And that's how they knew about me. And I have never, when it comes to terminology, I mean, I felt really out of place for the first 5, I still feel out of place in a lot of UN meetings because they use a lot of terminology that I don't use. But the reality is, I know the reality on the ground. And that's basically what you have to show up, recognizing that you are the leader, you are the expert in the room. It doesn't matter if somebody comes and says they're an expert on trafficking because they've done some research. You're equally an expert because you've seen what it looks like on the ground. And that's what you contribute. You don't need to know the terminology. Speak in your own terminology, because that's the only way things change. We can't keep playing dress up and assuming that we're gonna, that's not our job, right? Our job is to say, listen, you need us because we have experience and we have knowledge that you don't have. That's the bottom line. And in order for us to really have that conversation legitimately, then you need to have the substance of the information. So you need to know what the SDGs are. The UN doesn't need to train you on that. You can go online, find them, find the resources. If you want to be a leader, you take the time, you sit down, you say, listen, if you're going to take the responsibility of being in your community and having ownership over projects and going to local schools and going to local leaders and going to your ministers and talking to them, then you need to know your stuff. So sit down, learn the SDGs. If there are specific questions you have, there are a million, other than the classes they've done on the SDGs, there are a million resources. You want to learn how to write a grant? It's there. You want to find a mentor? Go online, find somebody who you think is really, really intense and smart and knows all of their stuff, and send them an email, even if it's a cold email. Reach out and say, listen, I have some ideas, I have some questions, I need some help, right? And there's no problem there. That's how I've met most of the people I think have been great resources to me. But the reality is, no one is gonna come and say, hey, do you wanna be a leader? Let me train you. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think it's very sustainable. I mean, let's be blunt. There is not a lot of incentive for young people to be engaged in this space. Most of us, if you're in university or you're just recently out of university, you are trying to build your own life. Pretty soon, some of you may have debt, some of you may not. Some of you may want to buy a house, some of you may want to pay off your car, some of you might want to get married and have kids in a few years. Some of you guys might want to travel like all your buddies, right? And this does not pay very well. There's not a lot of awesomeness here in terms of incentive. There isn't. A lot of you who have gotten degrees in economy could probably go and make 3 times as much as bankers. I mean, that's the reality, right? So at some point, I think you have to ask yourself, why am I here? Why did you fly to Rome? What were you coming for? What do you need to stay engaged? And if your answer is, I need training, that's a real easy fix, right? We can do online courses. I'm sure SDSN can get enough of you guys to say, listen, we need a training, and you'll do a training. Will that be enough? Is that what will keep you engaged? And I see people nodding their head no. So what is it? What makes the SDGs relevant in your work? Because I don't think it's one training. I don't even think it's multiple trainings. A lot of organizations have tried that locally. So what is it? And you all can think about it. It's not a return and if you come up with something, let me know. But be honest with yourself. Is it like Sam said? Do you guys need better paychecks? Do you guys need more support? Do you guys need jobs? Do you guys need authority? What is it? and come up with substantial things where you can create an actual blueprint for engagement so that there is a connected network of young leaders that A, are engaged, but B, know their own thresholds, know what their interests are, and know how they can best engage in the SDGs in the long term, because this is 13 years, right? The last thing is, how can we use the tools as a toolbook, is what I wrote. So I don't work for SDSN, so I have no idea what the SDSN toolbook is. Is that a thing? Okay, well, I wrote, okay, well, maybe there should be. Maybe that's what they're trying to tell you. There needs to be a toolbook of, I don't know, young leaders, guide to transform the world or something. Listen, what I picked up from your question was that some of the people you work with don't know what the SDGs are. They don't even know the terminology of trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with you on that. In Libya, we never used the term SDGs when we did our public campaigns. We never used Resolution 1325 when we did our public campaigns. We actually used ending the cycle of violence and family and community building when we spoke to people in the public, and we used a lot of the political terminology to get access to political leaders who had the ability to ensure that our public campaigns were more successful because we were allowed in schools and given free media, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have different conversations with different groups. The same way you would say one thing to your parents and you say another thing to your professor and you say another thing to your friends. They can all have the same meaning. At the end of the day, you have the same value and you have the same purpose. But it's really about recognizing that if you're going to go into a community where 90% aren't literate, talking to them about something called the Sustainable Development Goals is going to be more or less irrelevant to them. If you're going to go into a community that's in conflict, that has very little respect or trust for the UN, telling them the Sustainable Development Goals are in their interest is going to be irrelevant. So I don't think it's necessarily that you have to use the terminology all the time. It's about knowing that the terminology and the platform is there for you to access and leverage when and if needed. Right? And recognizing that there's a community of people working on the SDGs. So you might be working in your country on trafficking with people who don't know what it means, but maybe you can leverage another young woman working in her own country on trafficking to create some sort of public support or some sort of engagement. And a lot of that can be done through people you meet because they're working on the SDGs. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think it's very much about leadership and knowing what's the language you use when.